Hello, this is Lorelei Rutledge with the I Lead Utah Accessible Tutorials team. This tutorial, titled Providing Service to People with Disabilities in a Culturally Competent Manner, will describe some of the basic tenets of cultural competence, some of the different models we have for understanding disability and impairment, and describe how cultural competence principles can help library staff provide better service to patrons with disabilities. The Association of College and Research Libraries defines cultural competence as, quote, a congruent set of behaviors, attitudes, and policies that enable a person or a group to work effectively in cross-cultural situations, or the process by which individuals and systems respond respectfully and effectively to people of all cultures, languages, classes, races, ethnic backgrounds, religions, and other diversity factors in a manner that recognizes, affirms, and values the worth of individuals, families, and communities, and protects and preserves the dignity of each." End quote. The reason that thinking about cultural competence in relation to people with disabilities is important is because it encourages us to not only think about finding useful tools and technologies for people with disabilities, but to think about them as a unique group of people with unique life experiences and viewpoints that we can learn from. In other words, it helps us see the whole person. To contextualize this, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the models we have in our society for understanding disability and impairment. This is a very brief sketch, so I would encourage you to check out some of the in-depth resources we will highlight in this presentation. Disability theorists define the standard social view of disability as a medical model or the medicalization of disability. In this view of disability, disability and impairment are synonymous. People are disabled when their bodies deviate from the norm, and disability is an individual issue or a, quote, personal tragedy where the person with an impairment has a health or social problem that must be prevented, treated, or cured, end quote. And that's from Oliver and Barnes, 2012, page 20. The appropriate response to disability in this worldview is medical intervention to help the individual function as normally as possible, regardless of what the individual with a disability wants or needs. The role of the medical community in supporting people with disabilities is very important. However, the medical model has a downside. It encourages us to see doctors, not people with disabilities, as the experts in their lives, and to see people with disabilities as somehow deficient or less than. This medical model is often undergirded by ableism, or the idea that it is substantially better to not have a disability than to have one. The medical model also plays a big role in how legislation is used to define disability. The major legislation in the United States that clarifies the state's role in defining disability is the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA defines persons with disabilities as anyone with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a record of such an impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. Major life activities include walking, breathing, seeing, hearing, speaking, learning, and working, activities of daily life like bathing, dressing, and getting around the home, and community and home management, for example, household chores, shopping, and getting around the community. However, many people with disabilities have argued that the problems they face are not only a result of physical difference, but rather a result of how society excludes people with disabilities. This is the foundational belief of the social barriers model. Proponents of this model argue that impairment or physical difference is separate from disability, which is the result of physical, economic, and social barriers. For example, they might argue that a person in a wheelchair's disability stems from not having access to ramps to enter buildings, not from his or her impairments. They argue that the appropriate response to disability is to reduce barriers by making physical spaces accessible and reducing discriminatory practices, and that the problem is society and not the individual. From this perspective, we can begin to see people with disabilities as a unique cultural group that routinely faces stigma in society. As Olkin argues, quote, there are many similarities in the minority experience. whether it is based on disability, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. The essential definition of a minority group is not numbers, but the experience of prejudice, stigma, discrimination, and oppression. The prevailing perspective is from the vantage point of the majority group, and that group is seen as normative." End quote. The way this may function with people with disabilities is that our society tends to see non-disabled folks as normal, and people with disabilities as somehow abnormal or less than. This can lead us to ignore the ways in which we could provide better service in some cases. For instance, we often focus on having one area of the library that has special technologies for people with disabilities. Wouldn't it be better if we set up our libraries so that they were accessible to everyone, regardless of perceived ability or disability? So what does this mean for us as library professionals? Thinking about how we understand disability in society is important because understanding some of the stigma and discrimination that people with disabilities experience, both as a result of the physical world and social attitudes, can make us attentive to how they may experience some of those barriers in our libraries. It can also help us think about how we can provide better support for patrons with disabilities. Thank you for watching this tutorial. For more information about serving library patrons with disabilities, please visit our website at accessibletutorials.org.